All right, I think it's
All right.
time.
Yeah.
All right, I'm Dan Montgomery. I'm an engineering program manager that works on security and identity for Google.
Hi, I'm Piyush. I'm a software engineer who works on cloud identity over Proxy, which is a BeyondCorp implementation for GCP apps. I'm going to talk about today about enabling BeyondCorp in your organization. And I'm going to start with the basic problem of what are the problems and complications by deploying VPN in the modern world where a bunch of enterprises are moving to cloud, and how the modern solutions, which is BeyondCorp, can help achieve more granular access control for your applications, right? Then I'll go a little deeper into the components of a typical BeyondCorp deployment for your enterprise. And then Dan will take over to describe how Google approached the BeyondCorp solution for its employees. Then I'm going to, with a few demos lined up, and then I'm going to come up again to talk about how you can leverage any BeyondCorp deployment and how you can roll that out for your enterprise.
And we'll leave plenty of time for Q&A at the end, because that's often the most interesting part.
Yep. All right, so let's get started. So until a few years back, the access pattern for most of the employees was like most of the employees were accessing corporate apps from the on-premises, from their offices, right? But then things have moved on. The landscape has changed a lot. And we have a bunch of different roles in your enterprise wherein a bunch of customers, partners, employees, different profiles are accessing apps, and not just from the on-premise, from in the offices, but also from their mobile devices. Everyone has a smartphone. People are bringing in their own devices to enterprises, and a bunch of enterprises are also moving to cloud. So the network perimeter has kind of disappeared over the period of time, right? So at this point, the VPN solution that was primarily built for the on-prem deployments doesn't work anymore. It brings in a lot of complications, and if you try to retrofit that solution to the modern solutions, it doesn't work. It gets a lot more complicated. It defines a security perimeter wherein all the applications and critical data are intermingled behind that perimeter, right? And if any malicious user is able to get access to that perimeter, they can laterally escalate their privileges to get access to more critical data. Managing those security policies across the perimeter is not very seamless in this world wherein a cloud is also involved with your on-prem network. It's really cumbersome to manage. I've seen a bunch of enterprises do hierarchical firewalls to protect their critical data and then to protect their non-critical apps through VPNs, but it gets really complicated really fast. And it's not even helping the users who are trying to access the apps, right? They can't bring in their own devices. The admins don't have full control over the devices that the users are trying to access the apps from. They can't disable random app installs, and this leaves a security loophole in your whole infrastructure, and the hard shell doesn't work anymore. With that, what we really need at this point is that we need to deprivilege the network and move trust from a network level to application level, and we need to make sure that every request that's coming into your application is authenticated and authorized. We need more granular level access control with not just strong identity, but a lot more context for why a user is accessing the app and from where and using which device and whatnot, right? So with all of those learning and all of those contexts, Google built a solution, BeyondCorp, in 2011, wherein we had an enforcement point closer to the application, which was kind of a reverse proxy deployed in front of every application, and we had granular access level, which was being applied for every request that comes in, and not we deprivileged the network at that point, So there was no network perimeter, and this solution was built ground up for cloud solutions. Right? Every request was, at this point, is authenticated and authorized, and all of our employees are allowed to access the apps from anywhere. They don't really need to be at work. They can work from any Starbucks, anywhere. With that ground set, I'm going to dive a little deeper into the components of a typical BeyondCorp deployment. Right? This should be no surprise to anyone. There's a typical access to an application looks like this. There's a user who's logged into a system and is trying to access a web app or a VM or some infrastructure APIs. And since there's no network perimeter right now, there needs to be an enforcement point wherein you apply all the policies that someone has defined in the background for you, and every request that comes in for the web apps and for any of these resources is authenticated and authorized. Right? To support this enforcement point, you need to define, you need some kind of a policy engine wherein you can define these security levels of access, and you can say things like that, whether a user is able to access it from a public network or not, whether a user is able to access this app from a non-corp device or not, right? So these are the components. To go into a little detail, I'll start with the user. Email ID and password are still the primary attack vector for any malicious user to hack into an enterprise. So everyone understands we do need strong identity here, right? And things like FIDO security keys can definitely help with that. Having strong identities is the fundamental block there. But one of the fundamental pieces of BeyondCorp architecture is that we don't just rely on user identities. We also look into the context for which the access is being made, right? So that's where the device comes in, because that's the primary thing that the user is coming through. So the device gives us a lot of context, whether the device is corp issued or not, whether the device has all the security patches or not, whether what network the device is coming from. Is it a public network or is it your corp network? Is it in a geo restricted location? And what time of the day is? There are a few countries who don't allow workers to log in after work hours. So time of the day is also another attribute that you can think about there, right? And adding more attributes is just a matter of implementation. I'm an engineer, I work on that. So with that, all of that context, you can, an IT administrator, if you can imagine being an IT administrator, putting a policy like Alice is only allowed to access from a device with MAC address this and with an IP range of this and only from geolocation this gets really cumbersome really fast, right? So you need some form of an access, you need some kind of an abstraction over those kind of policies. That's where the rules engine comes in, right? What you need to, what BeyondCorp recommends is that you define a bunch of security levels wherein you bunch all of these attributes into as few security levels as possible, but no less, right? You can say that there's a security level which is fully trusted, wherein the user is coming from a fully patched security for a device which has fully patched security levels, and the device is corp issued and they're coming from a trusted network. Then the user is allowed access to all the apps in your network. You can have mostly trusted, wherein either the security patches are not installed, or the user is coming from a public network, and the user is only allowed access to except the most critical apps. He or she is still allowed access to most of the apps. And then there can be a security level wherein it's totally untrusted. A user is logging into your system from an airport kiosk, right? Just to look up his taxi rideshare code. And for those kind of apps, you can still have a few of those kind of apps like a taxi rideshare code, a lunch menu kind of things still available to all the public, but still with authentication. But you don't need such a security, such a secure with context or authorization at that point, right? So with that, sorry. So that's the rules engine wherein you define the security levels and you refine those security levels over the period of time. The enforcement point is still the primary piece of this architecture, wherein all of these policies are applied, right? And the rules engine needs to support that. And this enforcement, there are a few properties of this enforcement point that needs to be taken care of, right? One of the primary thing is very low latency, because you're authorizing every request that comes into the app. So this needs to be very low latency enforcement point. Moreover, even the web apps needs to validate that any request coming in to the web app is through the enforcement point. There's no backdoor that the user can access. Now, all of your endpoints are exposed publicly, so the web app itself needs to verify that the access is only through the enforcement point and not through a backdoor. With that, let's run through an example. Let's assume that Alice is an admin who tries to access a source code app or a help desk app. She's using a company-owned laptop from an allowed geolocation, right? The admin has set rules about accessing the source code and the help desk app, that access to source code is allowed from allowed geolocation from corp devices on a trusted network, and access to help desk app is allowed from mostly, it's kind of in a mostly trusted security level, wherein help desk app is accessible from anywhere but from a trusted laptop, right? So with that, since Alice is coming in from with all of these contexts, she's allowed access. But what if Alice travels to a restricted geolocation, right? At this point, Alice, when she tries to access the source code or the help desk app, she'll be allowed access to help desk app because the access level allows that, but she'll not be allowed access to the source code app, right? And this changes dynamically. As we say, every request is authorized, and I'm reinforcing that point again and again because that doesn't happen with VPN, right? Every request is authorized, so when Alice moves, the access moves with her as well. Another example is Joe is a contractor who's only allowed to access only allowed to access help desk app, but not the source code app. So even though he is using trusted network, trusted device, but the access levels or the permission, the rules that are set in the rules engine do not allow Joe to access the source code app, and that's why he's not allowed to access that. With that said, I'll hand it over to Dan to talk about Google solution.
I'll briefly talk about Google solution, and then we'll do maybe a live demo, if not a recorded demo at 1 a.m. last night. And this is just one way you can do it. There are lots of different providers, and this is certainly not a sales pitch or anything like that. So I'll go how we built the BeyondCorp solution for our cloud. So this is a similar diagram that Piyush had. Here we'll separate user and device trust. User trust, we have our IDP product, Cloud Identity. And I'll go into a little bit more detail before we get to the demo. Cloud Identity is great. It provides the normal user and group management, but it really adds in a lot of the two-factor and anti-hijacking solutions that Google has on their consumer side. Endpoint Verification is a lightweight Chrome extension and a native agent, depending on your OS, that does lightweight device reporting. All of these tie in with, IP subnets, geolocation, session age, time of day, and they fall into our rules engine. Rules engine is called Access Context Manager, and that's on either side if you're on GCP or if you're a G Suite customer. It's a single layer of infrastructure, which allows you to create the rules engine, or we call access levels. And then depending on how you use the cloud, depends on your enforcement point. If you are building GAE or GKE apps or putting any app on the web, or you're SSHing to VMs, for the apps you put on the web, it doesn't matter what cloud provider, or even if you're on-prem, you can still use Cloud Identity Aware Proxy. If you're managing GCP resources or GCP APIs, This is where you can then create a service perimeter around it with a product called VPC Service Controls. And if you're doing our collaboration or communication suite, G Suite, you can also apply these with Cloud Identity. So let's go into a little more detail. As I said, Cloud Identity is our IDP that does the user and group management. If you were all here for Christian's talk right before this, you saw that the phishing-resistant FIDO security keys is really the cornerstone for good security on the user. Christian is nodding, he agrees. And it really provides the extra layer. Piyush was talking about, we developed BeyondCorp in 2011. This was because of a state-sponsored attack in 2010, end of 2009, that compromised Google and a variety of other tech companies, Operation Aurora. And security key, no, okay. Security key is a foundational piece that prevents Google employees from getting phished. Do we have a public number we can say? Zero employee has been phished on security keys. There we go. Speaking of, we have a Titan security key. I won't go into too much detail since I didn't see too many people get up in between sessions. But what's really important here is it's an open ecosystem. We really want to work with organizations like FIDO, and you'll see a little bit more later on. And our Titan security key has a secure element with the firmware written by Google that really verifies the key's integrity. And Christian talked about that the Android phone is also a security key. One of the core tenets of BeyondCorp is to increase productivity amongst your users, especially in the changing workforce. So you don't only have employees that come to an office now. So BeyondCorp reduces barriers of entry to allow the employees to be more productive. Using your Android as a security key does that exact same thing. You don't need a dongle. There's a limited cost to entry. And it's really simple to have two-factor authentication that we think is highly phishing resistance. All right, let's go into a little bit more detail of how we set up context-aware access or BeyondCorp. A lot of the context comes from endpoint verification. It's really lightweight. It gives you an inventory view of all the devices that have signed in. So it might not be your corporate-owned inventory. You may see that some employees have signed in on devices that you didn't know about, or that some employees may have swapped devices that you didn't know about. And then it provides some basic tenets of device security. It provides screen lock, disk encryption, what OS type, what OS version, things like that. Then our rules engine brings in other areas of context as well. So geolocation or IP subnet or time of day, which allows you to make really more granular access levels for access. We announced at Next the BeyondCorp Alliance. And we understand that everyone has their security vendors and their endpoint management vendors already, and they often have a great relationship with them, and we want to meet the customer kind of where they are. So with all the companies you see here, we announced the BeyondCorp Alliance to be able to use context from these companies into access decisions. And we'll announce more later on this year to see when you guys can start playing with it. All right, the rules engine. This is the single piece of infrastructure that lives across all of our cloud that allows you to create access levels. And this is a really scalable piece of infrastructure that you can either use on the UI, you can use via API, or you can use via our gcloud command. So it is pretty versatile. All right, enforcement points. Cloud Identity Aware Proxy for web apps and VMs. I already talked about this a lot. What's really important is Piyush touched on that every single request touches this reverse proxy. So a key tenet of this is that the latency is near zero. Your users don't wait for a connection, and that's the really amazing part. And I'll repeat myself, this can be used with any provider, whether you're on-prem or on another cloud. You can set this up to route the traffic. Cloud Identity for G Suite apps. This is our productivity suite. So everything that you can do for web applications, you can do for Gmail, Calendar, Drive, Doc, Sheets, Slides, etc. I talked about some of the advanced security before. So let's jump ahead. And then VPC service controls for GCP APIs. This one allows, when you introduce cloud storage, you're really putting your data with a web endpoint. And this allows you to draw what we call a service perimeter, draw a perimeter around that data and prevent data exfiltration. And you prevent data exfiltration using context-aware policies that you set up for your other web apps. All right, let's try the live demo. All right, let's go to Bob. So Bob's a contractor. He's a Gmail user. We see right here. And that's really all he has access to. He does have this Chrome extension called Endpoint Verification installed, and you see it syncs pretty regularly. Now let's go to Dan. Dan's his administrator. So Dan pushed the Chrome extension to him. And if we go to the device management, if the Wi-Fi doesn't fail, endpoint verification. We see right here, Bob, he's running macOS 10.14.5. It synced less than an hour ago. It's a user-owned device, not marked as a corporate-owned device in the inventory. We'll then introduce context-aware access policies. So let's go under security. We have context-aware. And this is where you'll see the Access Context Manager access levels. So on here, let's open up Mac OS version. And I'll show this in more detail in 30 seconds. So right here, you see 10.14.6. And if you remember, I said that Bob was running 10.14.5. So a 0-day was discovered. You want to make sure everyone on your fleet upgrades. So you set 10.14.6. And then let's go ahead and apply the access level to Gmail, since that's really all Bob uses. So I'll go here, and I'll apply the macOS version. I'll save it. Some of the other things that you can do is I'll look at contractor office IP. You see the IP subnet right there. This is really powerful for let's say you apply this one to Drive. This prevents you from having employees log in the hotel kiosk to download a boarding pass they have saved in their Drive and accidentally stay signed in or accidentally download a whole bunch of kind of really business critical things. And then let's look at the device. So you see that password, encryption, you have OS type, OS version, whether there's Chrome OS policies, whether it's verified, whether it's a corporate-owned device. There's a little bit of versatility. The BeyondCorp Alliance stuff isn't here yet, so that'll come later. Let's switch over to Bob. So here, let's refresh the page. And you see he doesn't have 14.6? 15.6? Thank you. So he did not get access. Demo worked. All right. So here, let's switch personas entirely. Here we have Dan. And Dan is startup in stealth mode. And you'll see why in a little bit. And he has a web app that he's deployed, but he doesn't want anyone to see it. So of course, the logical thing for him to do is go ahead and put the reverse proxy, the identity-aware proxy that we have on it. So let's go and take a look. And you'll see that I preset this up. I cheated a little bit. So it says the configuration is good, and we have the URL. Then you see, oh, and I should have deleted that earlier. Then you see that we have different roles assigned, different users assigned to roles so they can access the web application. So let's go ahead and copy this web app to see if he can. You see he isn't in this list. I don't know how tiny that is. Oh yeah, okay. Better, a little bit. He isn't in this list. Dan is also running endpoint verification on here. So we'll go ahead and it'll deny access. And Dan's already signed in. If we open up in incognito mode, you'll see that it brings you to a sign-in page. All right. So then we want to apply context-aware access policies to this, right? Or no, before we want to make sure Dan can get regular access. So we'll add Dan to the role without an access level. You see it's here. We'll come back to that, though. So we'll save it. And we'll preload Access Context Manager. And here we see the access levels that we have set up. Let's see if I waited long enough or if nope, I'm going to wait a little bit longer just to show. I'll let it propagate through. So some of these access levels we see Mac OS only, so screen lock is required, disk encryption is required. You don't need admin approval, you don't need corp owned, but it needs to be a Mac. It can be any OS, but it does need to be Mac. Let's see if I waited long enough. Nope. All right. Let's go ahead and do a new access level, and so it doesn't yell at me. Identiverse underscore demo. These are the different attributes that are available. So we'll do IP subnets. You can do geolocation. So let's say you really need to exclude all users from Canada or something like that. You can go ahead and set that up. Other device attributes, I showed you this on the other one, is screen lock, admin approval, corp owned. All right, it's going to work. Hey. And the reason why he's still in stealth mode is he just built a Hello World app. So hello Identiverse. Obviously not ready for any funding yet. All right, so let's go right back and apply a context-aware access level to it. So we'll go ahead and delete Dan from there. I'll remove him, add a member. And this time, so remember, I'm still on a Mac. So let's go ahead and do a Windows-only policy. Let's say this web app is actually for your finance employees, and your finance employees only run Windows. There's no exceptions to that, so you can just put a blanket rule and then make it more and more granular as you go on. Piyush will talk about our tips and tricks for kind of how to get BeyondCorp going in your organization, because it is a major shift. So we see it on here. That it's conditions Windows only, and just to prove that I'm not faking this, I'll very quickly show you the Windows. So here you see it's required for screen lock, it's disk encrypted, and it requires a Windows machine. Propagation took a little bit longer last time. So let's make this smaller. Oh, it was fast.
Oh, sorry.
It was faster this time. So it successfully worked, and access was blocked. So this is a really, really simple access or example of how we do context-aware access in a variety of different either web apps or productivity suites. And Piyush will talk about kind of how we got here.
All right.
Oh, this is my video, and that's my other video. There we go.
All right. Thank you, Dan, for giving an overview of how Google adopted the BeyondCorp solution. I'm going to talk about how you can adopt that in your organization, right? So to start with, you need to identify one POC application, something which is not essentially business critical, but is used, still has usage enough so that you can test the access levels, right? So something like for admins a web-based dashboard that they want to access from anywhere, or for contractors a bug system that they want to access, that you want to limit access to only from corp devices from the office network only. Right? Once you have done that, you need to bring up an enforcement point. You need to expose those apps publicly on the public internet and add an enforcement point which fails close by default, so that when you don't have the access levels or when you don't have any kind of policy set up, no access is allowed. Once you do that, once you have deployed the enforcement point, you need to identify a set of users who will use those applications, kind of your alpha users, right? It's beneficial if you do that with your own employees, so that you can get quick feedback and you can iterate over that. The recommendation is to do that, manage the access via group, so that you have a kill switch. You just remove the group from the access, and everyone doesn't have access anymore. Once you do that, you extend the rules to be context aware, right? You make sure that you have corp devices in the policies. You make sure that the OS version, as Dan just showed, is up to date. The disk is encrypted. There's a screen log for the devices that are being used, and you limit access only to those devices. As we talked about the example, you want to limit access to bugs dashboard for contractors only from Office. So you may apply context about the IP address range that you want to allow access to, right? Things like that. Once you do that, you have one POC setup. Now you want to strengthen the authentication as well. Enforce use of video security keys, enforce use of only corp devices, make sure that the user's device is listed in the corp inventory, and you can track and manage updates over the air. Once you have that, you have one POC deployed end-to-end that you can sell to your leadership. And once you have their buy-in, you kind of move more and more apps behind from outside of your VPN behind the enforcement point. And then you kind of start tracking how many users are still using VPN, or how many users are have access to VPN but are not using those anymore because all of their apps are outside of VPN behind the enforcement point, the BeyondCorp, right? You identify the inactive users, you remove access for the VPN for those inactive users, and you track the active users who are still actively using VPNs, and make sure that any of the users whose all of use cases are met with BeyondCorp, you tell them actively to move to not using VPN. You'll still have a few users who will have special needs to access apps that you haven't yet moved beyond the BeyondCorp, no pun intended. Yeah, you go and iterate over this. You move more apps beyond, and you move more users.
One of the really interesting things is we allow for IP subnets. So if you're having organizational challenges to even do a proof of concept, you can set up rules that kind of mimic your in the office rules that are already set up, and then move a non-business critical application to that to kind of gain buy-in.
Right. Yep. And if you want to know more, you can go to cloud.google.com/context-aware-access, and feel free to chat us with offline.
Yeah, and we left a ton of time for Q&A.
Yes.
So do we run a mic, or can we just take audience questions?
Hey, what is the approach taken by BeyondCorp for the PEP, policy enforcement point, where did you take a centralized approach or decentralized? When I say centralized, is it a common reverse proxy that you used, or is more like agent-based, decentralized?
Are you asking about is the reverse proxy itself a regionalized or a centralized?
Centralized or agent-based?
So that depends on what vendor you're using. We don't. I don't think the BeyondCorp paper itself recommends anything like that. As long as you can achieve low latency with either of those models, I think it should be fine.
Okay, so either of the approach, right? So how are you trying to update the policy? So if you onboard a new application today,
right,
or like anytime during the day, how do you ensure you update those policies?
So it's kind of it's more generic question than BeyondCorp itself. It's essentially how do you propagate data to distributed systems.
Correct. Right? I'm trying to understand how did you address that?
In our system, so I think Google internally has a very sophisticated model of deploying distributed systems and distributing data to that. For Google specifically, the policy engine is a separate binary that runs in a distributed way, and the proxy itself will make an RPC to that binary. So any update to policies is pushed to those binaries via the whatever config distribution mechanism there is. And yeah, that's how we do it.
Do you want to? No. OK. I was going to have the TL give you a more answer, but if you want, we can talk after.
How do you handle end user confusion when all of a sudden access is working, suddenly it stops? From an end user's perspective, it looks non-deterministic, even though there's a fairly well-articulated technical rule set. I didn't see anything that indicated, from the demo, for example, I didn't see anything that indicated which policy they were actually in violation of. It just from putting on the hat of one of my end users, it just looks like suddenly it broke.
Right. So I don't think it's if it's a good idea to even show the access or the security levels to the end user or not.
Well, there's two train of thoughts here, right? Google has actually gone through our own journey of doing a self-service type fix. Versus a lot of the companies we work with want create a ticket to the help desk. You're speaking exactly to our roadmap in terms of you should be instead of the contact your administrator or contact this person, that there should be a more advanced kind of intuitive user training that goes on, and I would say that's coming soon.
Yep.
In my day-to-day life, using BeyondCorp and Google, I think I did an access deny screen that I wasn't expecting 2 times, and both of them were configuration bugs that were rolled back.
So I'll repeat. Most access is approved. One of the things we didn't get into too much detail is we have, I think, 10 or less access levels at Google. So we have a very, very simplistic way that we do access. So the point of this is it's invisible to the user. And 5 years ago, one of the first things, my first roles at Google was deploying security keys to all of our temps, vendors, and contractors. And we had OTP deployed, but we were deploying security keys. And one of the things that did is they actually cut our support tickets by 70%. Because OTPs can get out of sync, they lose them. We had security keys that stayed in the laptops. We find the same exact kind of decrease in support from the BeyondCorp model because for the most part, everything just works. But if you have a super complicated access levels and dependent access levels, you could definitely run into some solutions or some problems that we do have a solution coming down the line for.
For device verification, does that only work with Chrome?
Yes. Right now,
Bad answer.
right now, it is a Chrome-only solution, and I think that's vague enough that I can not give anything that isn't under NDA there.
Hi, I'm keen to understand where you see the context-aware access going. A lot of the focus right now is on context around endpoint, device type, source address, maybe role-based, but do you expect to have a more sophisticated rules engine that allows to obtain attributes from different sources or services that you could sort of, acquire at runtime and evaluate and make more broader decisions? Is that something that you're anticipating?
It absolutely is. Are you still talking kind of web apps and APIs? Or are you talking
web and
server
API,
to server,
I guess.
IoT?
Yeah, it could be anything. Service to service, web, API, yeah.
So for web apps and APIs, we absolutely see the future going in that way. And that's kind of what the BeyondCorp Alliance is all about. We want to provide the additional attributes or context from how you're already getting it versus from the platform. But we certainly see a lot of opportunity to kind of grow in sophistication. And BeyondCorp is really meant for the web apps and for the APIs. It's not really meant for the service to service.
Yeah, just a quick question. How are you protecting the traffic behind Cloud IAP if the TLS is terminated at Cloud
The
IAP?
TLS is terminated at Cloud IAP, and for unauthenticated DOS kind of attacks, we have a bunch of infrastructure in place that sits before IAP, so we are protected from that. And for sophisticated attacks like for request and replay, we have a bunch of kind of nonce kind of stuff, which and that's just one example, but we have a bunch of protection in place which will disallow request replays for any kind of request.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking more of eavesdropping or like man-in-the-middle type attacks between the IAP and the backend.
So that is all, once the TLS terminates at IAP, the network is internal to Google. So we don't consider a man-in-the-middle as an attack vector there.
We do before.
Oh, sorry, yes, we do.
Request and then it's re-encrypted using
Yes.
a different channel. And so
Yes, sorry about that. So it's we do encrypt the traffic within Google itself, but then those are some proprietary solution for encryption there. Yeah.
Any more questions?
If not, you get the good old, oh,
Does the Access Context Manager handle on-prem access to resources?
so if you are routing your on-prem web app through Cloud Identity Aware Proxy, it does. If you're talking about an on-prem only solution, it does not. But I resonate with your question.
Yeah.
I'm intrigued by the how mature your BeyondCorp rollout is at Google. I know you've been at it since 2010 in response to that attack. Yeah. What your access policy is. Do you have a stated policy that if you want to stand up a service in Google, that you've got to apply X, Y, and Z as a minimum standard before you can expose a service? And are you constraining? Are you using these same things, these same services, eating your own dog food effectively, only, or are you compensating for, the maybe immature nature of some of these things with other more traditional security methods?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question that I will try not to give you a political answer, but we'll see. Our BeyondCorp journey, we talked a lot about developing the proof of concept and then iterating, but we didn't talk too much about the long tail. And the long tail is definitely still there. 5 years ago when I started, I did use VPN for things. I haven't for several years, now that Netflix doesn't allow me to go to another country. But in terms of are we dogfooding our own? We are, and we have organization policies in place. Is it, to answer directly the second part, do we have other things in place too? We do. And we have an active plan to say we don't. So we're moving very quickly in the direction where we can say what we talked about today is all we're doing. But we're not quite there yet.
I'm just kind of curious how are you expecting reconciliation of data classification in terms of what you're actually onboarding into BeyondCorp as well? So you're saying I could download a bunch of business critical data onto my personal device and then never connect again? What is your context around what data is also presented to that individual in on top of the device contextual awareness?
Let me see if I understood your question. We are, so for the G Suite side, we would block access to Drive. Mm-hmm. Anytime you introduce fat clients, like Drive has a fat client that you can install, there are other solutions that will also add as a +1 on top, and we actively are adding those. In terms of if they had permission downloaded the data and then lost permission. I don't think that would fall more under the DLP products that we have and not in the BeyondCorp suite.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, you can imagine that the client, and I think this is the case in some of our clients and not in all of them, but directionally this is where it's going. You can imagine that the client is just cache a lot of the time for like G Suite, for example. So when you lose access, the cache should be invalidated, right? Like those are the kind of things that make sense. In the case of like Google GCP and not in G Suite, we have a much more sophisticated answer to that. It doesn't, like anytime you're talking about exfiltration, you still need a perimeter.
So when you're talking G Suite, you're talking a lot about cache, and wiping the cache is something that we're pursuing. When you're talking GCP, we have a much more sophisticated answer that starts off with VPC service controls that we talked to and extends further, and we're happy to go into more detail offline. Was that a good summary, Grant? Okay.
So in this case, since the Google browser is sending most of the user info, did app teams have to make any change to get onboarded to your BeyondCorp vision?
So for the device characteristics, it's both a Chrome extension that would need to be deployed, and if you're doing Mac and Windows, it's a native agent that lives on the device. So you would have to deploy those. If you're Chrome OS only, you don't. You would just, if you're managed Chrome OS, you have to push the extension and that's it.
Yeah, so I was trying to understand, if I'm an app team trying to deploy this BeyondCorp solution, what would I have to do? Was there something that the app team had to do to enact, like refactor their code or pass it to a new proxy like the identity-aware proxy that you have got? Was there any changes that the app team had to do to adopt this?
Yeah, you would need to enable IAP and then apply the required IAM role that is binded with the access level. So in the second demo, that would need to be done per application.
So, yeah. So,
Sorry.
You most likely will not have to change any code. The only thing that you need to ensure is that all the traffic that's coming to your app is only through the identity-aware proxy. And the way you do that is that you validate the token that's passed to you, and you invalidate any request that's coming to you without that token. So that's the only piece of code, and there are standard libraries to validating JOTs that should be a couple of lines of code that you need to add to your app.
Okay.
Thanks. Sorry about that.
So for those developers that are adding their app, like in that demo, would that be a flow that a developer would go through in self-service? Is there any limitation to what stuff they can set up so they don't make a policy that's not compliant, or is simple enough for a developer to easily jump on board with that?
It is that is the flow the developer would go through if they want to use kind of deployment managers like Terraform or something like that. You absolutely can. If you're creating an access level that doesn't work under some situations, we will throw an error at you. And I guess it's safe to say that we're getting more mature in that space as time goes on. Did that answer?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Cool. So you guys have been running BeyondCorp as a solution at Google for a long time now. Have you guys come across any weaknesses in the model?
No, I mean, we're all bought in.
Yeah.
And that's why a few years ago we started building this solution for our enterprise products.
Yeah, and just to add to that, there are a bunch of features that we know that we don't have yet, but are upcoming. So we know that we want to enhance that a lot more going forward, but we don't see any weakness. We are fully bought in.
I guess that's a fair point. We absolutely have a roadmap for where we want to go. Sure. And you know, like any enterprise, we wish that roadmap was already here and we were there. But we're all bought in.
Yeah.
All right, I think one more question, or we're out.
Yeah.
One more.
All right.
Pressure's on. No.
So you guys are recommending Titan key for a FIDO2 authentication, but from what I heard, you are using a different key for a FIDO2 authentication. Is there any security reason behind that? Why you don't use the key you are using for Google staff for other users for FIDO2 purpose, or is there any plans for Google staff to utilize Titan keys for their?
There's absolutely plans for Google to use Titan key, and I think it's historical reasons, unless Christian wants to give you.
Okay, I'll be quick. Okay.
Stealing the show.
Hello. Okay. So yeah, the Titan security key. There's two components. There is what we call the transport component, which is the thing that connects it up to Bluetooth or USB or whatever. And then there's the secure element. The secure element that's in the keys are actually exactly the same secure element. It runs pretty much the same firmware, apart from a couple of tiny changes, which is unique to Google internal use case. For example, FIDO doesn't allow for individual attestation inside Google for historical reasons. We do that when you register a key for corp use, so we can kind of do better asset tracking. This is things that we're now contemplating adding to FIDO2 as a formal spec. Once that has happened, we'll narrow that gap and actually go to exactly the same product line. But because not all of the features we need for corp internal use is in FIDO yet, we have a slight tweak. But the actual physical secure element that we use and the rest of the kind of the form factor is pretty much exactly the same thing. Yeah.
I just asked because the manufacturer can still do whatever you need from the current key, right? The thing is that these two manufacturers are different country or region. I don't want to name it here, but they have a, the companies you are using, right, for a Titan and for a,
right.
Yeah.
But the point is that doesn't matter because the secure element comes from NXP, right? And the secure element is injected with the firmware at NXP's point of origin, like at NXP's point of manufacturing. Then what you do with the secure element almost doesn't matter. You can ship that across the globe 3 times, put plastic around it, don't care, because the root of trust sits with the secure element that was injected during manufacturing. That's kind of the point that we're trying to make is if the root of trust and your kind of origin goes back to where the device is manufactured, and in the way that we manufacture it, we kind of and for better or for worse, when it's manufactured, it's kind of clamped down. No remote updates possible ever again. Kind of lock things in. At that point in time, anything you do after that almost doesn't matter because the root of trust goes back to that initial manufacturing date in the secure facility where the chip is manufactured. Yeah. Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.